While heroin seems to be making the most headlines recently, are there other drugs close to sparking a similar epidemic? And what other trends are making their way around the world? For more on that, let's bring in Sanho Tree, director of the Drug Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you so much for joining us here on America's Now. Well, let's begin with heroin. Communities throughout the U.S. are seeing this surge in heroin overdoses. People are dying. We've seen the photos of adults with their children in the back seat. They're overdosed in the front seat. How is heroin getting into these communities? Where is it all beginning?
Well, a lot of it is coming through over the borders, but also by sea, by air, by tunnels. So it's coming from lots of different places. Mexico supplies a lot of the heroin consumed, particularly in the east of the U.S., and Colombia also is a major producer of heroin. But of course, Afghanistan is also globally the biggest producer. But not much of the Afghan heroin reaches most of the United States. It's mostly coming through the southern regions to the U.S.
Why are we seeing this resurgence in heroin? We were speaking earlier, and when I think of heroin, I think back to the 80s and 90s when you heard about it a lot, and now here we are again, reaching young people. Is it popular? Is it because it's cheap? Why are we seeing all of
A lot
this?
of this is very cyclical. So you see these trends in different drug use. Different generations will abuse a certain drug. The younger cohorts, their siblings, will see that it's a terrible drug to use. They'll stay away from it for a generation, then it comes back. But a lot of this also comes from a confluence of factors. Number one, we've had an opioid prescription problem in the United States, driven by a lot of private corporations, the drug manufacturers themselves, who aggressively marketed OxyContin and other drugs for for long-term pain as well as short-term pain, which is very, very problematic. But apart from the marketing practice, we also have something what I call pill culture. So since 1997, our airwaves now are flooded with prescription drug ads. You can't turn on the cable news at any point without seeing just ad after ad every hour. You're bombarded with ads. There's a pill for every problem. And people no longer think that, they get accustomed to thinking that if it came from a factory that's been prescribed by a doctor in a prescription pad, that's been inspected, it comes in a blister pack, it must be somehow safe to use or the government wouldn't have approved it. And that's a terrible culture to create. But let's be honest here, there are a lot of people who really do need these prescription painkillers and aren't abusing. In fact, most of the people who who become addicted to prescription drugs are abusing and they're stealing. It's called smurfing, right? That you go to a neighbor's house or a friend's or steal from relatives to their medicine cabinet, that sort of thing, or the black market. And most of these people are not being prescribed these opiates by their doctors. So their introduction to the heroin may have been abusing prescription drugs shared amongst friends. And as that got more popular, our D.E.A. and other agencies had a very predictable response, which is to crack down on overprescribing. That not only hurt a lot of people who are in legitimate need of these painkillers, but also it helped push a lot of these people who were problematic users, having some dependency on these things, to find cheaper sources of opiates. And that, of course, was street heroin. You don't need a prescription. It's much, much, much cheaper, and it's everywhere. And word of mouth, you can find it. You don't have to figure out how do you get a fake doctor's prescription or where you're going to steal it from or anything like that. And so that was a very predictable trajectory, unfortunately. And the DEA's new policy, their current policy is to crack down on heroin, of course. It's a one-size-fits-all solution, but the more we crack down on heroin, when you already have so many people who are dependent on these opiates, what are they going to do? What are the dealers going to do? If the supply of drugs begins to constrict through the drug war, but you still have a huge population that's dependent on these drugs, the dealers are going to find new substitutes or new ways to stretch their drugs to maintain their profits or increase their profits. And that comes, here comes fentanyl, which is a really disastrous thing to happen to this industry, where it's much, much, much stronger than heroin. They mix it with the heroin, the dealers, in order to increase their profits, to stretch their drug supply. But the users very often don't know what's in there. And they think they're getting heroin, but in fact, they're getting something much, much more potent.
So is that the new drug to watch, fentanyl?
Yes, and there are all kinds of other substitutes. That's the nature of the war on drugs, that prohibition breeds substitutes that are often more dangerous, more problematic, more difficult to stop. And so we keep chasing this problem and creating new unintended consequences.
But obviously, there is a huge demand for these type of drugs in the United States. You mentioned Colombia and Mexico as suppliers or where these drugs originate. Where else in the world are we seeing this heroin epidemic take hold?
Well, in Mexico itself, it's beginning now, particularly in Sinaloa, and where the stuff is coming from, but also in Afghanistan, and a huge problem there. But in many other countries, this is not unique to the United States. But I think that our policy responses have been particularly bad, that have inflamed this problem. I think the Drug Czar's office, to their credit, has done a lot of good work promoting harm reduction, which just one administration ago was a phrase you would not have heard uttered in the halls of government. It was viewed as something too lenient, too liberal, not tough enough. But we realize now that being tough is not the same as being effective. That that the war on drugs teaches us that the one law that Congress can neither pass nor repeal, there are two laws: the law of supply and demand, and the law of unintended consequences.
Which countries around the world are handling the war on drugs the best? They don't have the same type of problems that the United States has when it comes to the demand for it.
Many other countries are doing this better. There's in fact, many of the solutions that we think are so elusive and so remote, in fact, already exist, but they exist in a sort of a mosaic around the world. So best practices from various countries can be cobbled together to create a much better holistic approach to this problem. For instance, Portugal in 2000 decriminalized possession of all drugs. They've had much better results now as a result of that. It's very counterintuitive, but better rates in terms of problematic drug use, ability to treat people, to divert resources from wasteful law enforcement and incarceration into prevention, dissuasion. Canada, for instance, is in the process of approving legalized prescription heroin for the most seriously addicted people. That is to say, if you failed at all other treatment modalities, that methadone hasn't worked for you, that abstinence hasn't worked, nothing else has worked, then it makes sense for the state to say, okay, you have a problem, you're addicted to heroin. We'd rather you didn't do it. We're going to make sure that it's not easy to get. You can't go to a pharmacist and say, I'm bored this week, let me try some of this or that type of heroin. It's only if you fail at other treatment modalities and you're intent on using heroin. They don't want you to go back to the street to buy street heroin, which nobody knows what's in it, right? It's very often adulterated fentanyl, or before that, sometimes it was 7% pure heroin, sometimes it was 70% pure heroin. That's a big difference. And nobody uses heroin with a purpose of overdosing, right? It's because they don't know what's in the street heroin. And so the state steps in and says, we're going to give you a regulated supply, not enough to keep you getting higher and higher, but to keep you from going to withdrawal, which is what most people are terrified of, and for the most problematic users. And that produces all kinds of second-order health benefits. That they're getting a pure supply, they're able to be monitored by physicians, they're able to, there are safe injection sites all over the world now, whether it's Sydney, Australia, or whether it's Vancouver, whether it's many European countries. The US is looking at, many cities now are looking at this idea of supervised injection facilities, where there is a nurse or a doctor on premises and a clean facility for people to inject to make sure they don't overdose. And in fact, no one's ever died from overdose in a safe injection facility. There's naloxone on premises if people are overdosing. There's treatment. People can be routed directly to treatment because those services are right there if they and when they're ready to accept that. So there are lots of different ways we can approach this problem without resorting to prisons and policing, an over-reliance on policing.
But why isn't it happening now? We see what's happening in Huntington, West Virginia, and several other states. I mean, it's really alarming. So if the United States is rock bottom when it comes to this heroin epidemic, what's stopping them from trying some of these things?
It is happening. It's happening in various cities around the United States, so local police departments are working with prosecutors. So there's the LEAD program, Law-Assisted Diversion Program, where the police actually try to help people. I mean, this is, when you're talking to drug users, that's something that's pretty revolutionary. The idea that they're not there to hunt you down and lock you up and punish you, but in fact to deal with some of the underlying problems, to get help. Only when you stop criminalizing people who have problems can they get help.
Because
right?
Going to the source is not going to solve the problem.
Oh, absolutely not. We've tried this for a very long time now. We already have much of a border wall, but Mr. Trump wants to build a much larger border wall. But the problem with that kind of folly has been just astronomical. So the first countermeasures we saw were, the traffickers would build ramps onto flatbed trucks, and they would drive right up to the wall, and they're literally driving SUVs over the wall. They're using catapults, Roman technology, to fling drug packages over the wall. They're using T-shirt cannons that have been modified to shoot projectile using compressed air, big bales of drugs. They're using narco tunnels. There are more than 100 that have been discovered, and Lord only knows how many more there are. And those tunnels, when they're open, can move drugs 24/7. And they can move guns and cash the other direction as well. So it's folly to try to stop this on the land. We've tried stopping it on the sea. So they switched from old fishing boats and that sort of thing, and speedboats, to now semi-submersible submarines and fully functional submarines as well that can dive up to 50 feet below water and move up to 10 tons at a time. This is an astronomical amount. And a border wall, it's going to stop people who are maybe in a backpack, migrants who are forced by smugglers to carry a package or two. That's peanuts. That's not going to make a dent in this problem when you're able to bring it in by the ton. There was a tunnel found in Tijuana, Mexico, a couple of years ago that was about to open, and these tunnels now have rail systems, electricity, ventilation, all kinds of very sophisticated tunnels, very deep. There was 40 tons of marijuana on the Mexican side waiting to come across the border to San Diego. So that's the kind of volume we're talking about. We also try to stop it by air. Traffickers used to use small planes, then they switched to one-way trips on old airliners that were, not particularly airworthy, but they could crash land on the other side, and it would still make a tremendous profit. Then they switched to things like ultralight aircraft, where they go above the wall, but below the radar, and they can pull a lever, and a drop cage releases hundreds of pounds of drugs. And now they're moving to unmanned aerial vehicles, drones.
When you look at the region, all the way down through South America, and you look around the world, what are you waiting for? What are you keeping an eye on? What is the next big thing? And what are you concerned about the most?
Well, I think one of the unintended consequences of this is that we have created a sort of an X prize, if you will, for finding ways to penetrate our borders. We create a tremendous incentive for drug traffickers to find new and innovative ways to get things across the border, right? Whether it's tunnels or submarines or whatever. And that is bad when you're dealing with drugs, but potentially it could be something worse. It could be, if God forbid someday they begin to work with terrorist organizations, this is not the kind of thing you want to incentivize. So ISIS or Al-Qaeda on their own would have no way to build these tunnels and come up with submarines and this kind of infrastructure. But because of the drug trade, we've created an X prize. The first one who can figure out how to penetrate our borders reliably can stand to make billions of dollars. And that will generate a lot of clever engineering to penetrate our borders. This is not an incentive we want to create. Also, it's important to keep in mind that the more we escalate the war on drugs, the more valuable the drugs become. So whether we're talking about cocaine or heroin or marijuana or methamphetamines, these are minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities that cost pennies per dose to manufacture. It's very, very easy to make this stuff. It's our policies of drug prohibition that make it so incredibly valuable to smuggle. And as it gets closer and closer to the final destination, as it crosses each international border, that package picks up, it snowballs in value tremendously. So we've created an incentive for drug traffickers. The more we crank up the drug war, the more valuable the drugs become, the more traffickers are attracted to this economy. That's a catch-22 of the drug war.
Sanho Tree, thank you so much for joining us on America's Now.
Thanks for having me.
America's Now